now, you know, uh, got it. Okay, let me give my PowerPoint point here. Let me just open it, and then I will share it. Narrative and decoloniality. Right. There we go. Let me go back in. Here we go. Right. Are you able to see clearly
Yes,
now?
wonderful.
Right. Okay. Let me go through this. Okay. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to give a very brief, overview, which will necessarily be brief, brief overview of decoloniality. And instead of going into lots of theory about decoloniality and narrative, I'm going to actually do decoloniality and narrative. And I'm going to look at it. I'll come back to it at a later stage, but I think in order to talk about decoloniality and narrative, I'm also going to start out very briefly, locating it certainly within a university context, and I'll talk about South Africa that I know a little bit about. And then I'm going to look particularly at reflexivity, how we are socialized to read the world and how others are socialized to read the world. And I'll be very specific about that. And then I will go into some of the examples that you sent me, and I'll touch on some of those examples to give perhaps a group view of what people in this group spoke about when I asked, what do you think decoloniality is? And I'll tie it to some of the ideas that were brought up earlier. And in this way, I think it's very important to reflect how narrative as a method is reflected in the theory, but also brings new meaning to what we take for granted. So let me not, delay and go into this a little bit more detail. Now, I think if one looks at the history of university education, the university model and very much universally is built on colonial and Eurocentric assumptions across colonies and continents, such as the Americas, Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. And today still, Euro-American knowledges are regarded as universal. And then not only that they're regarded as universal, but they valorized with the dismissal or demeaning of ecologies of knowledge. And I think that is what's really important in this whole debate. It's actually about when people say, oh, what's this decolonization about? It really is about shrinking the world that we ought to know, if I can put it simply. And it dismisses the ecologies of knowledge and its value from all people across the globe. And it's what's often referred to by writers, decolonial writers such as Dos Santos, as an epistemological and intellectual centering accompanied by epistemicide. So epistemicide really refers to the murder of knowledges, if one wants to put it very simply. And that is what Dos Santos says, that, colonial relations murder knowledges. So we actually know less than we can know. Now, what is interesting here is that when we look at what Maldonado Torres thinks about as decoloniality, and I like this reference, I've used it in an introduction to a special edition that I guest edited with Paul Duckett in 2018, a guest edition of the American Journal of Community Psychology on teaching towards decoloniality. And I gave a short overview of colonization and decoloniality, of curriculum, and how there are so many examples of how one disrupts or works toward, you never get towards disrupting completely, but works towards disrupting those understandings. So I'll send that piece to you afterwards. There are 3 pieces that I'll send to you after. The one is Carolissen and Duckett, which I'm referring to here, and where I use this quote. It talks about, Maldonado says, decoloniality is about breaking down hierarchies of difference that destroy efforts at rehumanizing the world. And of course, it's about working to restore humanity, human dignity. Because what colonization does, it does not only take resources and assets from countries and people, but it also dismisses people's identities. It destroys people's identities, or attempts to, let me rather say that, attempts to destroy people's identities, but also the ways of knowing. So it's to efforts at rehumanizing the world, to breaking hierarchies of difference that dehumanize subjects and communities and that destroy nature. I like this, and to introduce and to talk about the production of counter discourses, counter knowledges, counter creative acts, and counter practices that seek to dismantle coloniality and to open up multiple other forms of being in the world. You see, this is particularly, there are narratives about how we should be, but of course, those are very limited narratives. And this is what he says is part of what decoloniality is about. Now, I like this image that, or the parable that Michelle Fine uses, 2018. She talks about the idea that coloniality and knowledge and being creates vampires. Now, that's a very interesting concept, because, of course, myth has it that if vampires look in a mirror, they don't see reflections of themselves. And similarly, she argues, when marginalized people traverse society, they traverse their environments, particularly their learning environments. For the marginalized, there's little or no mirroring of themselves, their histories and resources, and what we end up with is deficit pathologized understandings of marginalized groups. And I found that a very valuable kind of image or metaphor that she uses. If you read Michelle Fine's work, you will notice that she uses a lot of metaphors, which I really like, because it simplifies quite difficult concepts. So I thought, now with all of this that we face when we think about, you know, coloniality and how that impacts on the fabric and being of our everyday existence, our subjectivities, the narratives that we internalize, what is it? Where do we start? And one of the things we need to ask ourselves is, what provocations do we experience when we read ourselves and others in the human, animal, and material worlds? Now, I think what is very interesting about this image that I have here, and it comes from the famous South African artist Bernie Saul's collection, Color Me, where Bernie Saul grew up with a label like I did of colored, which meant we had less privileges than people who were classified as colored during the apartheid era. In a reading that I will also give you, which I did with Jessica Fernandez, Garth Stevens, and Christopher Son, that was published last year, we did an article called Roots, R-O-U-T-E-S, Roots, and Roots, R-O-O-T-S. So Roots and Roots to Decoloniality. And some of it we reflect on where we come from. Now, on how we have traversed our journeys within psychology. And I think it's helpful to do that. What Bernie Saul did as an artist, this is one of her ways of thinking about and thinking through and creating artifacts around thinking through her journey reflexively. In this particular piece, she speaks to her own histories of being being a descendant of slaves originating from Java, and looking at the spices. What she's done in this picture is actually really clever. She used spices, and it's a series. So this looks like paprika. She also did installations where she used turmeric, which is yellow in color, and cinnamon to cover her body and photograph herself. But what's interesting, the paste of the spices covers her mouth, reflecting silences or silencing. So it's been very interesting how this has been brought, and she works with memory and identity in all her work. And this is one of the ways in which she has, in her work, expressed her own narratives of what it meant or means to be, to grow up in a society where you are less than human, or you've been told throughout your life you're less than human. So I think it's very important for us to understand what provocations we experience when we read ourselves and others in human and animal material worlds. And so what I've done here, you see, it's not about us as individuals, and that is often what we do when we think about reflexivity. When we think about reading metaphors and narratives and images in the world, we have to be particularly attentive to reading quite a few things. One of the questions we need to ask when we think of provocations is, how do we read bodies? And I just gave two examples here. The one is, how do we read the picture in the first picture? It's a black or colored woman, if you were in South Africa, wearing a hijab. How do we read it? Do we read it as a black woman? Do we read it as an African woman? But of course, what I'm saying here, when I'm looking at these pictures, are very descriptive narratives about how we read these pictures. There are also incredibly demeaning narratives that form multiple layers of how these pictures are read. So images of terrorism, multiple images that come to the fore and that circulate in everyday life are then part of these images that one reads. And I mean, I could ask you, and you would probably be able to generate all of those stereotypical and demeaning images. So that's one way in which we understand or come to understand our world, through reading bodies, because there are narratives that circulate. But we can also read artifacts, such as statues and institutions. So on my left, and I used images that, from the two universities. I'm sure if you think of your own institutions and your own environments, there are multiple images that you can think of. So on my left, probably, yeah, I'm not quite sure on which right of the screen, but on my left of the screen, there's the infamous Rhodes Memorial that was, until 2015, part of the landscape of on the campus of the University of Cape Town. And on my right is an image of Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Now, what is very interesting is that both these, when we read artifacts, they are not neutral. They represent deep, deep colonial histories with institutions. And I think you should look around the institutions that you form part of. Very briefly, the first Rhodes was a colonist and a colonialist, and a British colonialist, drew significant resources and enormous wealth from his accessing and taking by force, the resources, and particularly the diamond industry in South Africa was people drew enormous wealth from diamonds in South Africa. So, so he was, one of the arch colonialists in South Africa. Then, secondly, Georgetown, Washington, D.C. has a deep Jesuit history that draws significantly on slaves and slave labor. And in the last 5 years, one of the bigger issues was that, in terms of reparations, Georgetown will provide free education for descendants of slaves who were that were used to build and contribute to the institution. So it's similar debates, different parts of the world, but it's important to look at how we read artifacts, statues, and institutions. The next issue is also about reading texts. Now, I probably do not need to say anything, or very little rather, about critical race theory, because this has been really vilified, particularly in the US, to the extent that some states in the US want to ban it in schools, and that kind of, if I can call it, a conservative debate has even wafted to our shores here in Cape Town. So critical race theory, and then also Karl Marx's Das Kapital was actually physically banned in South Africa for many years. So the point I'm trying to make here is these texts are never neutral. There are deep emotions around how, in fact, we read this as a context. How do we read space? Here we have two pictures. On my left is an intensely, densely populated, informal settlement in Cape Town. So if ever you've been to Cape Town and you leave the airport to go to the more affluent suburbs, which you will see on the right-hand side, like Camps Bay, you will drive past a community of informal settlements called Carolissen that has a population of about 100, 150,000 people. Often there are large families living in these small, densely populated, very poorly serviced homes. But on the right-hand side, often that actually, to me, looks like an apartment building, but often that is a home in one of, in a suburb like Camps Bay, which was incredibly wealthy, incredibly, expensive property, often a family of 3 or 4 people living in a home of that size. And when one can also read space, and these are we do this quite unconsciously. I remember quite a couple of years ago, I visited Northern Ireland. And for many of you, or some of you who have been to Northern Ireland, you know that the pavements are coded, are they Protestants, or at the time, certainly that I was there, I haven't been there in the last 5 to 10 years, but certainly at the time that I was there, people could read symbols as to where Protestants and live, where Catholics live. And people told me, people look for clues. And so it was very difficult if one was working with young children or adolescents who immediately started looking for clues when they saw me or engaged with me, to fit me into a box that they've been socialized into. The narratives that they've been taught helps them to understand the world. So we do that all the time, but here we're reading space. Now, the point about talking about all of those different ways, or certainly some of the ways in which we read, space, text, bodies, artifacts, is this really core concept in terms of decoloniality, and that's critical reflexivity. But it's not only a concept that is core to decoloniality, it's core to narrative as well. But I want to add a few riders. Often, and in my discipline of psychology, when one talks about reflexivity, and so I want to distinguish between reflexivity and critical reflexivity. Often when one talks about reflexivity, people tend to reflect on the internal worlds, right? What is, and then perhaps the relationality in the context of their families, their parents, perhaps even friends. And so it remains on an intrapsychic and at best an interpersonal level. Now, what I'm saying here is that reflexivity is decidedly different from critical reflexivity. Critical reflexivity would include all of those ways in which we read bodies, spaces, ourselves, text, etc. And the questions I may want to ask then, what would your own roots be towards decolonizing psychology or your own discipline, starting in your own backyard? And what may your associated activities be involved? Now, I'm offering, and I'd like to hear, and you can paste comments and questions on that, because I'd like to hear what you think too. It may be a reading group. It may be, and people are going to be shocked. Oh my goodness, why a reading group? But if you want to ask questions about that, I'm very happy to talk about that. It may be a reading group. It may be working with communities that focus on various initiatives. It may be doing research with communities that find your skills valuable. So it's referred to by Mary Watkins as mutual accompaniment. And it may also be forming networks with others around various health or other issues. And so it's referred to as solidarity. So I think what is also important to think about perhaps is what are the knowledges that you know and that have been passed along intergenerationally, but historically erased and perhaps co-opted into Western medicine, mental health care practices, and practices that you are familiar in your discipline. I think those are really important questions to think about. And I think what I started out with, that we must acknowledge the pluriversality, multiple ways of knowing and building knowledge from below. Because part of what dominant narratives do is that they reinscribe power and privilege in society. And so that's often associated with whiteness, Christianity, heteronormativity, patriarchy, and these are but a few examples of dominant power relations central to the functioning of coloniality. And I think what is really important is that disruptive narratives, acts of refusal, begin to unsettle subjectivities of power and privilege. And that's really particularly important. Now, I want to pause at this point and ask if in your group you have any comments on and questions that you want to raise, or perhaps share something that resonated for you in terms of your own ideas. And then I want to go on into looking at some of the work that participants from this class sent me to show really practical examples about how I use visual narratives, and I'll give examples of other visual narratives that I used. So for now, I'm going to stop sharing and come back to you as a group and open up for some questions or comments before I continue. Ronelle, you almost invited this question. What have reading groups to do with decolonialities? You know, I think I often, often students ask me or tell me, oh my goodness, we just do reading. We now reading Fanon. We're now reading some of Achille Mbembe's work. We're now reading in psychology. We're reading Watkins. We're reading some of the work and articles that Urmi Dutta and Christopher Son and people like that are writing about. And it just feels like we're doing nothing. I often tell students and even colleagues that it is such an important component of re-educating ourselves because we are often, and I think it's very seldom that we find people who haven't been schooled in Euro-American knowledges. We all know the Freuds and so on very, very well, we know, but seldom do we engage with the work of Fanon. I mean, in my undergraduate curriculum, I certainly didn't hear anything about Fanon. And I think it's a very important starting point to start reading, to hear what people in different on different continents thought, read, and wrote, because often university education does not include these important ecologies of knowledge, as I referred to initially. Yeah, I hear Fakile is saying I benefited a lot from Black Thought reading groups that were outside of academic groups. Fakile, I think that's a very important point you're making. I know that certainly in 2015 and 16, when, the fees must fall and the roads must fall movement was in full swing here in South Africa. Some of the things that students did was to get together reading groups and to read this kind of authors that are very seldom included. Yvonne, you have your hand up. Yvonne, you're muted.
Sorry. I just wanted to say thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. It has really given me a lot of insight. I'm looking at the Zambian school curriculum, that is in that case looking at a text as a narrative, where I'm going to be looking at the school curriculum as a text. And one of the things that has resonated with me is just having that Eurocentric knowledge in the school curriculum. But my colleague and I are doing a paper on First World War. In that paper, what brought rise to that paper is the centenary celebrations that we had when Prince Harry came to Zambia to celebrate with us the centenary celebrations of the First World War. And so we went back to our curriculum, and then we couldn't see the contribution that Zambians gave in the First World War. And so we realized that we were missing in that narrative. And so I've really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you.
Yeah. And I mean, that is such important work. And that's why I always ask people, what are you doing right in your own backyard? Because often people think, oh, these are huge, major things that we have to do, but we can start with small acts of refusal, acts of rewriting, for example, our history, retelling the narratives, and we can do it in different ways. So thanks for that contribution.
Can you see, you can see Sarah's contribution, can you?
Yes. Let's see, Sarah, you said, thanks, Ronelle. This is such a wonderful presentation. I found the example of Georgetown University insightful in terms of ways of restoring and repairing. Are you able to share any writers, thinkers podcast with us who talk more about the examples and methodologies of this happening here and on the continent and globally? And what do you know? I was very impressed with as you heard in my introduction, I spent 3.5 months at the University of Massachusetts Lowell during my Fulbright research scholar program. What is very interesting, and this is a global issue, it's by no means an African issue, it's not only a European issue, it's a global issue. I think when one looks at institutions, and this is one of my areas of interest, so when one looks at, and that's why I can talk a bit more about it, when one looks at institutions of higher learning, so universities and so on, they often embody decolonial symbols. And what was fascinating was a program that is run by Professor Bob Ferrand, who's a history scholar, and he has gotten his students into re-looking at the whole story of indigenous people in the town where I lived and where the University of Massachusetts is located, Lowell. There are different campuses, but I was at the Lowell campus. Very briefly, the university or the United States celebrates Columbus Day, Christopher Columbus, but that has been renamed to be called Indigenous Peoples Day. So what Professor Ferrand and his students did was to have a Indigenous Peoples History Walk. So I got up early one Saturday morning and joined them on this Indigenous Peoples Walk. And it was fascinating to walk around the town and to see what, for example, the university had been, not that the university encroached, but they became a beneficiary of colonial legacies. So one of the examples I can give you, and there's a short film that Rob Ferrand sent me that I'm very keen to share with you. One of the things that they did was, for example, name the university's mascot Chief Charlie. Now, they changed that in 1994 because it drew on, the kind of, it drew on demeaning and marginalizing narratives of Indigenous First Nations people. And they renamed the mascot the River Hawks. And what they are doing at the football stadium is to put a plaque as to why it was changed, also why the flags are changed that are hanging from buildings along the American national flag, plus the University of Massachusetts flag, and then there's an Indigenous people's flag, and also the ways in which for example, the Indigenous people are depicted. And so that was an intervention, that Indigenous Peoples Walk, plus policy changes within the university, was a very clear, or is, I should say, a very clear example of how one shifts the narrative and practices within the university. Another example, and these kinds of things all fall under visual redress. Certainly at my university, during the apartheid years, of course, the university where I teach was centrally involved in developing the theory of separate development, which led to the implementation in policy as apartheid. All the ministers that ran the apartheid government were trained at my University of Stellenbosch. So there's histories of actively colluding and encouraging apartheid, which led to the dispossession of land, of people's being, of knowledges in quite distinct ways. So many people with the Group Areas Act, which defined where Black, colored Indian people could live, part of the university encroached on land from which people classified as colored were removed because that was declared a white area. So the Arts and Humanities building at my university today stands on land that was dispossessed from Black people. And so that history was, for example, reclaimed. And so bursaries and scholarships have been made available to descendants of people who lived on deflactor, which means the plains, and that was referred to as that, deflactor, and they are now able to study with financial support at Stellenbosch University. So there's another example of a similar intervention that Georgetown did. Also, I mean, one other kind of intervention, apart from this practical intervention, when our university was 100 years old in 2018, the university president did a public apology for the trauma and the dispossession that the university contributed to putting in place. And it didn't only remain as an apology, the words were verbally inscribed on the library walls. And so all students who go to the library, we hope, will read that apology on behalf of the university. I think there are very critical views of that. It's attempt at not only visual redress, but redress in person. And these are some of the practical things that, that people are doing. Yeah. Are there any questions or comments? Anybody else? Hands up. If you can help me look, because I can see a few spaces at the top of my screen.
I don't think there's any other hands at the moment. So maybe you want to continue.
No hands. You can continue to type in the chat box as well, because I will see it and respond to it. Right. Okay. What I want to do now, and please ask more questions, because my style is to respond to questions. I want to look, because I think I looked at some, I asked the exercise that I gave prior to starting this session was to ask you to take a photograph and or draw a photograph from the internet and talk a little bit about, write a few sentences about that depicts decoloniality to you, or decolonization in psychology, or any discipline that you are part of, and then to say something about what it is that you write something in some text, attached to that. Now, here is one small exercise that really is quite expansive, because it may generate ideas that perhaps theoretically relate to decoloniality. But for me, this is the core of narrative. Narrative allows ideas that perhaps we may not have thought about to emerge. Not only ideas, but subjectivities, ways of thinking and being in the world to emerge. And I think this is really valuable. So let me show what some of your peers did, or some of what people in this class did. And I'm just going to lift it and share it on my screen. So if you can give me a short break here. I'm going to open a few pictures. I'm going to open 5 pictures and then speak to those. I opened more. So what I'm going to do, let me just share my screen again. I think one of the, okay, can you see the screen? It says you can see it, okay. So what I want to look at this, this person said, and if people put their names on, that's fine, but if they resist, if they change that, that's also fine. This person says, I purposely took a focus on resistance It gives agency to individuals. There's an explicit mention of racism. It starts with the story of the enslaved and it ends with the story of masters. Now, I think what's very interesting in this particular picture is that uh, uh, it says, this is an example of learning materials developed by Richard Kennett, a British history teacher who's part of the IFTIN project, an ongoing research project at the School of Education, University of Bristol, that seeks to better understand the educational experiences and aspirations of a Bristol Somali community. And Sylvia then said that this image shows an example of teaching history to a Somali community in Bristol from a decolonial perspective. The focus is on resistance by highlighting racism, and the story of the enslaved in Africa is a great example. Moreover, the given agency to individuals shows how a decolonial perspective in education contributes to empower Somali students. And remember the analogy of the vampire. I think this is very interesting because, I mean, I think history itself is such a contentious topic, and it's often told from the perspective of the masters. And I think there's much opportunity to do this kind of disruptive work through changing the master narratives in this work. So here's an example that one of, that Sylvia gave. But I think one of the overarching narratives that in fact impact on this is the whole story of curriculum and whose story gets represented and how marginalized people are represented. And I think that those are really, really important stories to consider. The counter stories that must be told so that the counter stories also become part of the mainstream narrative. Let me look at two more, and then I'm going to give you, because I know we're going to run into half an hour soon of time left. Let me look at one. Here's an interesting one. And just before this, I had a meeting that dealt exactly with this issue. This Sumaya sent this contribution. She said, these pictures were taken in my private psychology clinic in Tehran, Iran in 2017. I have permission from the kids' parents to share the images. The woman in the picture below, here we go, is my friend and colleague running a puppet therapy session. She's a child psychologist. Now, she asks these questions because obviously when one looks at images like this, questions are generated. What is the kid's emotion? Why this puppet? Where is the puppet character from? Is it a Western puppet? Does this kid talk, think based on puppets' dialogues? The answers show us how other cultures can impact culture, identity, and media. In my view, some important therapies and treatments cannot truly conceptualize what is going on in the mind. The puppet talks on behalf as a person, of the person as role play, but this puppet who is a symbol of another culture, how can it present the thoughts and language in this Iranian child's mind? When I asked my colleague about that, she said, our children like the puppets and characters. They know their stories, and these puppets can be more helpful. They are more acceptable for children. So the puppet talks, the kid listens. My question then is, who exactly talks? The Iranian psychologist or Western treatments? And I think this is a very...
Ronelle, do you think you
yes?
could, sorry to interrupt.
Oh, sure.
We can't see the image yet.
I'll move the images. There we go.
Okay, thank you.
I think what is very interesting is to I mean, we can't interpret what the child's face means and the looking into the ceiling. But I think what is very interesting here, and what is perhaps fair to say without going into too much detail, is that the issue that is raised in these images for, let me just check the name, for Samaya, is the issue of culture fair tools. It's been a huge issue in psychological literature, and
still can't
I'm.
see it.
Can't you see it?
No, it's not moved. Sorry.
Has it not moved?
Nope. It's the first one still.
Oh.
Maybe you have to go
Let me
stop
just do a
sharing
new
and then go
share.
back in.
Let me just do a new share.
Yeah, that sounds a good idea.
Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank
So
you.
there we go. So I think what is very interesting about this image is that you can see it's one may want to then ask, what are the images that will be contextually appropriate? Because in the same way that we think about reflexivity or critical reflexivity, we always then think of context. I started my discussion about how we read context, essentially. And I think this is one of those disciplinary situations in which we need to ask ourselves, how do we read context? And if, Samaya is critiquing this, and perhaps you can comment on this, Samaya, if you perhaps critiquing the use of this tool as representing Western culture in a completely different context, what are the kinds of images that you may use? I know during the transitional period of 94 in South Africa, this was one of the very issues that was raised. What are the symbols that we may use that are different? Who becomes part of advertisements, for example? Is it only white people who can have nice white teeth when they're brushing their teeth? or what are the symbols that we use? And I think this is a very important question that is raised in the context of decolonization, particularly in the context of psychology. Okay, let me see. Can't see the picture yet. Okay, I got it. Okay, so I'm going to maybe show you one or two more images, and I want you to notice that in every example that I'm providing, there's a key context of marginalization and oppression, because that is the context in which colonization and coloniality happens too, the internalization. So, I mean, I think, one of the other issues, of course, is perhaps, yes, this child has already been socialized to internalize, these images through the consumption of culture, which Sumaya also refers to here, that these are acceptable cultural images in the context of Iran. And I think this is often a very similar issue that comes up in the context of do children see themselves reflected in the images of books that they read? So, for example, do Black children read books where the protagonists are only white? Do girls read books where the protagonists are only the people doing the important things are only men? And I think it's these kinds of things that we must think about through. Because of course there's much implicit learning that takes place, and that's why this is really important when we think about curriculum, but it's also important when we think of our interventions in settings such as these, mental health interventions, wherever we actually work. What are the narratives that we are propagating? let me show you one more picture. Can you see the screen on the Avengers, or must I share it again?
Not yet, not yet.
Not yet, okay. So let me stop share. Let me move that one up. Avengers. Share screen. Right. Can you see it now? It says you can see my application. The Chilean Avengers. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So Tamara says, she captions this, the Chilean Avengers. She says for her, this is what decolonization means. It says these photographs were taken in the context of the social revolt of Chile in 2019. It's a collage, the most important period of social mobilization in the last decades of my country. It shows different types of subjects who took to the streets to protest against an economic and social model that has made life precarious. Some of the slogans that guide the sentiment of these mobilizations were "until life is worth living" or "until dignity becomes customary." Fascinating, that concept of dignity. This crisis meant the questioning of ideologies that have governed the country not only since the military dictatorship that clashed it between 1973 and 1990, but long before. In this sense, the enormous protagonism achieved by the native peoples, particularly the Mapuche people, becomes relevant. Their flags were waved massively in every demonstration, as well as statues of heroes linked to the colonization and extermination of native peoples were demolished to put in their place symbols of indigenous resistance. In the lower left corner of the photograph, we see a demonstrator who's representing an individual of the Selknam people, inhabitants of the Chilean Patagonia, who were brutally violated by the colonizing company and even exhibited in human zoos in Europe. I consider that these exercises of political memory that take up these subjects and these struggles are related to a search for identity that contrasts with the hegemonic narratives that have sought to understand the Chilean in a permanent aspiration towards the first world model. And so here again is a combination of images of refusal, which is central to the discourse of decoloniality. And I think it's what has become really interesting for me in South Africa over the last 10 years is this insertion of human dignity into protest. And it's fascinating that, here again in the story that is shared here, we have the story of dignity inserted again. So I think these are really, really important ways of thinking. I'm going to share one last, because I think this is the kind of shifts. The next image that I want to show you, the last image, is one that I'd really like to share all the images, but one that we are looking at very commonly these days in terms of lots of feminist debates around, for example, gender-neutral toilets. So this, it says you can see it. So this participant said, I'd like to see more gender-neutral centering within the semantics, symbolism, and lexicology of institutions, as well as in their very foundation. in order to make more inclusive spaces for all students and staff, regardless of gender and sexual orientation. So I'm going to focus just on that. There's, a few more pictures, and I can collate all of that, to put all of those together and then share it with the group, because then you can read it for yourself. But I think what is fascinating about this debate about gender-neutral toilets, it goes around, a lot of it is around safety and inclusivity. And I think, we start seeing this, certainly in my institution, we're starting to see some of these kind of sort of almost new visual representations entering normative spaces. So that's very interesting to see that some of those disruptions are starting to happen. So yeah, look, what I'm going to do now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'd really want to ask you to thank everybody who, and I want to echo what Corinne said. Yeah, so, to thank everybody, and, just to check, to respond perhaps to Corinne, if you do not want your images shared. Otherwise, I'll put them in one email to Corinne, and I will ask her to share it with you, along with 3 papers. Right, are there any other questions? Because then I may like to tell you about one more example of work that we've done. I'm just checking, Corinne, was the session supposed to run from until 7 or 7:30?
This session just goes till 5:30. Oh, yours, yeah, 5:30, 7:30 your time. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, 7:30
Right.
Yeah. If that's okay with you, Ronelle, if you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'd like you to ask questions or comments, perhaps make your own comments on some of the images I've shared. And then I may go on, depending on how many questions there are, to talk about the project that I'm involved in.
It looks like people may want to hear about the project now.
Okay, right. One of the projects, and then you can think about also type questions in here. One of the projects that I'm involved in is called Feminist Decoloniality as Care. One of the reasons, and it speaks to the whole issue of working with young Black women lecturers. Now, why do we work with young Black women lecturers in a participatory project? So it's a research and intervention project. We're working with young Black women because, of course, as the statistics show globally and in South Africa, is that Black women are most poorly represented in as academics. So they grossly underrepresented in the large numbers of university students, but who are Black women, but very few who then take up academic positions. I think in the UK, 1% of academics is Black women, and that is basically resonates globally. So what we've done is we've designed, some colleagues of mine and I at the University of KwaZulu-Natal and Durban University of Technology, we've set up a program where we have a participatory network. We use much of it, we use narrative methodologies, and those range from drawings to photo voice to collages to using letter writing to each other. So people, I think what is very interesting and very constructive about that group is that, you know, I mean, I think one of the issues that, one of the comments that people made at the beginning of that group was to say that I have never been, she said, I mean, that was very striking for me. She said, I've never been in a group of only Black women academics, and I feel so seen and heard in this group. In this group, I'm not part of a minority. And I think it's in that group, what is really interesting is the recognition that many women themselves, Black women themselves, feel that it's an individual battle that they fight when they experience you know, the marginalizations within academic context. But when they come into a group like this, they actually see it's part of a structural engagement, because it can't be that everybody has similar experiences when in fact you know, the hegemonic you know, kind of discourses and the impacts of that are not at play. So it's a group it's a project that's been funded by Mellon. And in fact, I'll send you a paper that's just been published in one of our local South African journals, where I talk through much of what theoretically we think about when we use these methodologies and when we run this participatory research with young academic women. Yeah, and theoretically we draw on decoloniality, but we also draw on the theories of the ethics of care. We also and try and merge that when we think about how, on an overarching basis, to disrupt some of the impacts of managerialism and neoliberalism in higher education, which also is another force that marginalizes and defaces people from the humanity, their own humanity. And so, yeah, that is one of the projects that I'm engaged in, that specifically focuses on on decoloniality, and also uses extensively visual methodologies in the context of thinking about narrative. Okay. Kifuo, may I ask how it assists Black women who are aspiring academics? Yes, I think that's a very good question. I think often one of the things that happens to Black women academics, they often feel that it's difficult to break into networks where some of the important steps that needs to be taken to progress in their careers get shared. So in informal kinds of settings, often, and that's been my personal experience too, the tips and tricks of the trade get shared informally in reading groups that happen outside of the university, and not only on golf courses, in reading groups, in little running groups, etc., etc. So often, ways in which to progress in the career, to set boundaries, are not made visible directly. So one of the things that we do in these groups, we speak about a 5-year plan. And we show young women how to work within that 5-year plan, and they do their 5-year plans for themselves. So a lot of it is support and mentorship. We do not only do research, because it's participatory, we're also running regular, say, 6-weekly groups with women. It's a small number of women that we working with. But we run regular groups where we discuss distinct topics. And I think what has been really interesting, and we detail it in the article, is that a number of participants have gone on to publishing, to get access to accessing networks, because they now know this is what we must do and how we must do it. How to set boundaries on overloads of teaching, overloads of nurturing students. And also one of our and two of our participants, a number of our participants have progressed significantly on their PhDs to complete and work towards completion. So I think there are a number of benefits that women who are part of this research project and intervention are actually saying that they are drawing from this engagement in the company of women who face very similar kinds of setbacks in their own careers and barriers. So I think, how is this different from some of the other kinds of interventions that have happened? So in universities, and certainly in South African universities, there are multiple interventions to grow talent, to grow your own timber. But I think what's interesting about that is that people focus on certainly looking at how you grow your academic careers without giving space for people to talk about the dynamics of oppression that they experience within the university, and perhaps how to navigate those, because those are perhaps as important as delivering the academic work. So it's, and in fact, there is a very large program by the Department of Higher Education and Training called Future Professors Program that works on the principle of getting people to be mentored academically, but not psychosocially as well, and then doing international exchanges. Go spend 3 months here, go 3 months there. And I think what many of those programs fail to do is to understand how oppressive structures impact on people's belief and on their, essentially on their identity, their subjectivities, and how they need to engage with that as well in order to produce, so to speak, academic work that they'd like to do. So I think, yeah, that's one of the kinds of projects that I'm involved in that draws on this kind of work that brings together narrative and decoloniality in a kind of very practical way, and drawing on different theories too. Right. Any questions, comments? I know it's getting to the end of your week.
There might be other people who sent you material, I guess, Ronelle, who might want to just say a word about what they sent.
Yeah, would you like to?
I think there are about 10 or 11 people who sent things right now.
Yeah. Would you like to see? I will show.
Oh, okay.
Right. Right. Let me just share my screen. I'm going to show this one here. Here is an exercise. Catherine Morgan from Bolivia. It seems you can see the application. So let me just remove this. It says Amazonas women, her ecologic lifestyle is harmonic with nature in front of consumer culture. The Great Moxas is a huge extension of the Amazonas region, the Bore, Mojo, Kayayara, Arawak, and other communities inhabiting here. The people have a cosmovision to understand the human condition in the same level than the other life forms and habitats. So I think here, this particular contribution from Catherine draws on, you know, you know, the whole kind of critique of what humans have done in a capitalist world, and how repair is partly about then living you know, in harmony with our environment as well, with humans living in harmony with ecosystems, with animals and other humans. So yes, very, very appropriate. So that's one. This is another one. Let me stop share and then I'll just share the screen again. In this depiction, this participant says, I think this picture depicts decoloniality in psychology, particularly in South Africa, because on the one hand, it feels like an impossible task, and on the other hand, because psychology was instrumental in perpetuating colonialism and the apartheid regime. Traditionally in South Africa, psychology played a key role in colonizing structures and discourses that aim to marginalize and disempower non-Western sources, knowledge sources. So in our efforts to decolonize psychology, in a way we are attempting to dismantle the very tool used to perpetuate it. And I think this is a very, very common kind of idea that that gets that is discussed and that is part of the debates in decoloniality. And I really like that image on the left, you know, of this that it feels like an impossible task. And sometimes, you know, I just often say it feels like an impossible task because you think, oh my God, how are you going to do this? But it's the important thing is perhaps to start small and build from there, create different cultures and cultures of care. I would almost venture to cultures of care that humanize. I would almost venture to say, probably easier said than done. Let me see one exercise. Then Rebecca, let me see. I'm just going to show Rebecca's picture, which is, yeah. Let me find Rebecca's picture. Yeah. Rebecca shared this picture. She said it's an installation view of the video installation Heard Story by Mina Hint and Lisi Elma. And she says the photo is by Anna Stina Strickland. Let me just move it down so I can see what she commented specifically. She said the interviewees in black and white screens were men and women who were publicly notorious for their homophobic attitudes at the time. I recently wrote a paper where I compare their post-Soviet homophobic mythic narratives with Soviet-era, very limited public materials about homosexuality, criminal records, mass-published sexual health handbooks, and indeed, Heard Story is singular and expresses the Soviet attitudes, while the present-day experience has shifted from this singularity to a more pluralistic mindset. So again, echoing some of the core issues of decolonization in this instance, people who are marginalized because of their sexual orientation. I'll just move it up a little bit so you can see the picture a little more clearly. One of the art installations. Let me see, I think that is about it. I think I showed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There, I've showed the eight pictures that were sent. So yes, that's essentially very interesting depictions that all of you sent.
Thank you. I think that was a very interesting range, wasn't it? Taking in a lot of different.
Yeah, I mean, from eco-vision right through to resistance to protest, and actually, I mean, it's a wide range, and really it just depicts the levels at which people are marginalized and dehumanized in terms of hierarchies that exist in our society, and that the methodologies that one can use to think about it. I mean, in this particular instance and presentation, I've used one form of a visual methodology. I think you know, you spoke about visual methodologies earlier on in the week as well. But in this particular session, I think Jill herself spoke of, I see now Joel Bradbury said, yes, wonderfully creative. Joel spoke to visual methodologies, but in this context, I linked visual methodologies to decoloniality and decolonization, and thinking about how we can practice refusal and resistance through this process.
Thank you. I think we're going to make a plan to collate all this wonderful creative stuff that you did and get it so that you can all see it. And then, so thank you so much for everybody who contributed. And then, but thanks, big thanks to Ronelle for this. I think it's been a really insightful and inspiring way to finish off. So thanks so much, Ronelle. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks very much, colleagues. I really enjoyed, you know, doing this. You know, it's always really interesting working with a different audience, because it's just interesting, no matter where one actually does all of this, that